before we start lecturing, let's talk about this is our last day of hybrid, which apparently a lot of people are taking advantage of. So Monday, we are supposed to be 100% back face-to-face. I'm going to keep turning the video on, but it is not an excuse to not come to class. It is a way for those people who can't come to class to keep up. If you can't come to class, I will catch Shayna. We're talking about our new reality that as of Monday, we are back 100% face-to-face. This is our last hybrid class. And they say we won't go back to hybrid. I didn't think we'd go back to face-to-face, so we'll just see how it goes. I am going to keep the videos going because inevitably somebody's going to get sick and not be able to come to class. And I understand that. And it doesn't have to be with COVID. I don't want you coming in here with flu germs or strep germs or any other kind of germs. So if you're sick, stay home. Stay in your dorm, stay wherever you live. But you have to let me know. I am no longer going to automatically count you present if you put your name in the comment list. Put your name in the comment list, but I'm not counting you here unless you tell me why. Now, I will allow for 2 lazy days. I do realize that there are just some days you just don't want to get up and get dressed. And I would rather you log online and watch in your pajamas while you snooze in bed than skip it entirely. And just email me. I'm using a lazy day. You only get 2 of them, but you have them. Now, you can't be sick every day for the rest of the semester. I'm not necessarily going to ask for a doctor's excuse to begin with, but if you're sick every day for 6 class periods, then maybe you need to give me some sort of documentation. Does that sound fair to everybody?
Yes, ma'am.
All right, because I do want to make it accessible. I don't want to make it, draconian, but at the same time, students do better if they actually show up in class. And it's pretty, I can look at the test scores and your attendance, and there is a direct, you're the last, there's a direct correlation. So that being said, that is what we are going to start on Monday. I'm not really thrilled about doing the video every day, but we'll do it anyway. I've done it before, so it won't kill me. It just makes me uncomfortable. All right, so we had started talking about slavery in the South, and slavery was everywhere. At this point, in the late 1600s, early 1700s, every colony, all 13 of them, recognized slavery, and it has been codified by race. If you're African, more than likely you are a slave. There are free Africans living in the colonies. Some of those first wave of the ones they brought over in 1619, they were treated more as indentured servants. They served their time. They got their freedom dues. Some of those go on to own slaves, have plantations, do what everybody else does. But for the most part, if you're African and you're in the colonies, you're more than likely going to be a slave. So we talked about how there's more. Okay, let's just skip to where we're at. The African roots. Now, a lot we talk about slaves as if they're one group of people. That all African slaves came from the same place, or that all of Africa is the same. But Africa was like every other country, it's a big continent. I mean, it's a big spot. Is Africa a continent?
Yes.
Okay. I said it and then I doubted it. It's a big area. The people who live on the east side are not the same as the people who live on the west side in every aspect. The people who live in the mountains are not going to be the same as the people who live by the sea. Just like in Europe, just like in the Americas, there is a lot of diversity. And there are a lot of different languages, different customs. And that's completely ignored when the Africans are brought over as slaves. You're just African. I say that there actually is a little bit of picking and choosing. Slaves from certain areas of Africa were good at planting. Slaves from other areas were good at fishing and harvesting from the sea, and they were sought after for specific areas. The rice plantations sought slaves from a certain area because there's an area of Africa that's very much like South Carolina, Georgia, and have that tidal region. And they were used to it and they knew how to deal with it. But for the most part, we just lumped them all together. There was some similarity in kinship and political systems. Most tribes were matriarchal, as in it passed down through the mother's family line. Most tribes were hierarchical, meaning there was a definite caste system. At the top, you had the priest and nobility, then you had farmers and craftsmen, and then you had slaves. Slaves in Africa could be war captives, they could be criminals, they could be debtors. But in Africa, you had more rights as a slave. You could marry, you could have children, and your children weren't automatically slaves. That's not going to be the case when you get to the Americas. And I'm saying Americas, it's the colonies, but also the West Indies, the Caribbean area, and that was even worse. In Africa, most of the time, men and women worked together. Religion was central to life. They believed in a supreme creator, but they also believed in lesser gods like rain gods, fertility gods, that lived in animals, lived in nature, lived in streets, spirits lived in trees and rocks. And they also believed that their dead acted as mediators. So you could pray to a dead relative to mediate, to intervene on your behalf. It's not that far from Christianity. It's not an unusual beliefs, but that's kind of what they bring with them. I'm just giving you this idea so you kind of know what they bring with them. In Africa, Africans preyed on Africans. There were diseases in Africa that kept most of the white people out. The slave trade occurred along the coastline. Slaves didn't all come from the coastline. So, rival tribes took slaves and sold them to the Europeans. Most of the time they took men, but they also took women and children. It was a horrific situation. A lot of, like 1 in 7 died in transit. So they packed them they literally packed them in the ships like sardines. If you could put one more person in, you still had room. 1 in 10 ships suffered revolt, with an average of 25 killed for every revolt. I don't know if that's Europeans or slaves or both, or a combination. Problem with revolting on a ship is, if you have no sailing experience and you win, what do? You got to keep somebody alive to help you sail, but still better than, at least you have some freedom. Once they get to America, like I said, they are treated all the same. Most were barefoot, ill-clothed, poorly housed, poorly fed. They did what slaves did. They dug ditches, they drained swamps, they built dams, they clear and tend the fields, cultivate the tobacco and the rice and other crops later on. That's going to kind of change a little bit as you get into the 1800s, when Southern planters have so much money invested in the slaves, and slaves are worth so much that it's actually cheaper to hire an Irishman to do the dangerous jobs. Digging ditches doesn't sound like a dangerous job. It is once the ditch is over your head. Digging ditches can be very dangerous. Building dams can be very dangerous. They can break. So you hire an Irishman to do that. Even though you're going to have to pay him wages, he's a whole lot cheaper than losing a slave. Because when he dies, then you're done. You don't even have to pay him if he dies. It's just a bad situation. Now, of course, slaves are human. They're going to rebel. Rebellions were normally put down swiftly and harshly, much like we treated the Indians. But there's other ways to rebel. There's subtle ways. I mean, and I'm sure you have all done this when your parents ask you to do something you didn't want to do. It takes 5 minutes to wash a sink full of dishes, and it took you a half an hour. Slowing work down. Resisting work. Doing things wrong so it has to be redone. Sabotaging crops, stealing tools, hiding tools, breaking tools. Running away was one of the last ditch efforts, because runaways were treated very harshly. Beaten, burned at the stake. I'm sorry, being burned at the stake has to be one of the worst ways to die. I can't imagine. And it's been in it's been in human culture forever. I mean, it's biblical. The Romans did it. I can't remember the name of the Roman emperor, but he was a jackass. Sorry. He would wrap Christian live. This is when the Christians were being persecuted. He would wrap live Christians in cotton, soak it in fuel, and use them for torches for his parties. Burning at the stake has got to be one of the worst ways to die. But they did have ways to rebel, and they did have ways to strike back. But they were stuck in a very bad situation. Slavery differed from region to region. There were only 2% of the population were slaves in the New England colonies. They recognized slavery. It just wasn't a big part of the population. About 8% in the middle colonies. Most in the middle colonies and the New England colonies practiced something called, that has been referred to as family slavery, where the masters and the slaves live in the same household. It's not like a plantation where you have the big white house up on the hill and then the slaves live in these little shacks down here. In New England, in the middle colonies, if you owned a slave, you only owned one or two. They lived with you. You spent time with them. And when you spend time with people, you get to know them. You grow attached. I mean, it's not a true family attachment. Nothing changes the fact that you're property, but it was a much more tenable situation. They did a variety of tasks. It wasn't like on a plantation where all you did was hoe cotton or tobacco or rice or whatever it was. The South had most of the slaves. Most worked on farms and plantations. By 1750, yeah, okay, we're good. There were about 150,000 in Virginia and Maryland, about 60,000 in South Carolina and Georgia. Compare that to about 33,000 throughout all of the colonies that weren't Southern. In the North, okay, let me go back to this. Most of the slaves in the South came from the West Indies sugar fields. There were revolts. Revolts were very rare. Like I said earlier, the risk is very high and the punishment is severe. But the threat of a revolt was also real. And white Southerners are going to grow almost paranoid about fears of a black revolt, particularly in places like South Carolina, where you actually have more Africans than you have Europeans. It's not a self-fulfilling prophecy, but the fear of it is much, much higher than the actual risk. This happens in the North as well. So we're going to talk about this. In the North, most slaves lived in towns and cities. They had more opportunities to move about. New York, as I think I mentioned this before, had more slaves than any other city. And the fear of revolt was real there too. And they have two instances in the North that kind of solidify this fear. One happens in 1712, where there are a series of arsons throughout the city. And the slaves get blamed for it. So they pass black codes. It's the first time we have actual black codes, controlling just the movements of the blacks in the city. The more severe one was the Manhattan, what has become to be called the Manhattan-Salem witch hunt, that starts in March of 1741. And we will talk about the actual Salem witch hunt later. But this one kind of works along the same line. It starts out with a woman, Mary Burton, who is an indentured servant who works in a tavern, reporting that there's going to be a revolt, a rebellion. No rebellion actually happens. She just says there's going to be one. She reports it. She blames John Houston, who is the tavern owner where Mary works. He is also a dealer in slaves. He's a trafficker. And they start naming, she starts naming names, and people start getting, pulled in, jailed, hung. It eventually evolves into a papal plot where she starts implicating the Spanish and the Catholics as an attempt to overthrow New York as an English colony. Before it is all done, half of all the adult male slaves are in jail. 5 Spanish blacks are hanged. John Urey, who was a teacher, who she claimed was a Jesuit priest and Spanish spy, is hanged. So in the end, 21 people, 17 slaves, and 4 whites are hung. 13 slaves are burned at the stake, and 72 are deported, probably back to the West Indies. And it only stops when she starts naming the names of prominent citizens. And they're like, okay, it's getting carried away. But this fear is real. Marriage is outlawed in most colonies. I think we talked about this on Wednesday. However, most slave owners saw it as a good thing. It was a stabilizing influence. And it gave you powerful domestic ties that you could use as leverage if you needed to. And then later, it's going to be the way that you have natural increase once the slave importation is cut off. Slavery is going to touch almost all colonial activities. There's very little that's going to go on that isn't touched by slavery. It's going to be an influence on almost everything, for good or bad. Remember when we started this section, we talked about conflict and accommodation. There's a lot of accommodation here. A lot of the African culture is going to get integrated into America. You know, we call America a melting pot. It's really not. It's more like a stew. There's little bits. You get certain different flavors. It doesn't all come together and blend into one bland thing. And this is part of that. You're going to get these different languages, these different words, different foods, different songs. We're going to see it with almost every group that comes over. And in the South, well, really everywhere, but in the South more, you see the effects of people growing up in a biracial community. It wasn't homogenous like a lot of the northern communities were, where you had just one group of people, and that affects things. All right, more about the South. So remember we talked about how the Carolinas, most of the South were proprietary, and a lot after the British Civil War were settled by the Cavaliers. Well, these Cavaliers bring with them this very cavalier attitude. I mean, they're knights in shining armor. Manners are foremost. They mimic the English aristocracy, and they'll go into debt in order to do it. Appearance is everything. They included all of the social seasons that you would have in Europe, the theater and the cities, hunting, fishing, riding, gambling. So you would have fox hunts. You would have all of these trappings of English aristocracy. And by the early 1700s, the Tidewater gentry in Virginia and South Carolina had kind of reached their peak. This is when you start seeing the big white columned houses being built, and the plantations with the long drives with tree line. In fact, one historian, poor North Carolina was so undeveloped that they were referred to as the Valley of Humiliation between two mountains of conceit. And you get the beginnings of this very Southern culture where pride is very important. We'll talk about this more as we get closer to the Civil War, but a Southerner could be completely pleasant until you crossed him, and then he was ready for a duel. That idea of honor starts in this time period, and it's going to kind of color how they grow. They keep out a lot of people. Now, education was another European issue. The families that did value education usually sent their children abroad, either to England or France, to be educated. We talked about how right after that religion goes back and forth, and Virginia will eventually allow other religions, but in 1642 they decree that the colony is to be Anglican, and quote, all nonconformists can depart with the colony with all conveniency. Runs out the Puritans and the Quakers. Sorry, put those two words together. But religion in the South was a little bit different. Virginia Anglicans were not quite English Anglicans. The scattered population, the absence of bishops made central control difficult. They were not all that active. One estimate puts fewer than 1 in 15 in church on a regular basis, which is, while they were still religious, they were not actively religious as you see in the North. And it creates a different tone. They're less demanding than in the North. In a very Southern fashion, they're conservative, rational, and formal. They value collective rituals over personal experience. You're not going to have anybody going up to declare that they're saved and give their personal narrative. There's no self-denial in the Virginia Anglican Church, no fire and brimstone. And they stress the reasonableness of Christianity, the goodness of God, and the capacity of humanity to practice benevolence. And I bring this up because it is another one of those factors that underlies the character of the South. They weren't Puritans who believed that they had to do good in order to not go to hell. God was a good person, or deity. He was reasonable. So your chances were pretty good. And it's more of a laid back attitude towards religion. And that translates into the rest of life. Now, there is the hypocrisy that these people who believe in a benevolent God own slaves, but we don't talk about that. We will talk about it. They didn't talk about it. It's hard to reconcile the two, but when it comes to money, it's not as hard as you would think. All right, let's stop talking about the South for a while. Let's talk about New England. All right, New England was set up on townships, whereas the South has more plantations. They pretty much just translate where they came from to where they went. The English village becomes the New England town. Land policy in New England reflected social and religious purposes. So as we talked before, when they first got there and they were living a communal life, everybody worked the land, then the land gets divvied up. Depending on your hierarchy in the church, you might get better or worse land. There's few tracts of large land to go around. And depending on where you are, a lot of this is rocky, and you're stuck between the mountains and the ocean. Townships were granted to organized groups who divided the acreage by equity. Some divided into strips like we talked about, with a little square in the middle and people moving out. Later, they went to separate farms where you had your own little farm. Some of the townships sold the land rather than just granted it. But it's very much the English village when you get up into the New England area. Daily life, like we talked about, was initially you lived where you could find a hole to stay in that gave you some protection from the elements. But once, caves, wigwams, tents, whatever. But once that starving time was gone, they started to build these English village. Hand split clapboards with steep roofs. You have to have steep roofs in the north to shed the snow. Otherwise, your roof will collapse. By the end of the 1600s, most people lived in plain but sturdy houses with fireplaces. And there's plenty of wood to fuel those fireplaces. Some even had glass, but glass was taxed as a luxury item. The interiors were plastered and whitewashed. I personally hate white walls. I don't think we have a single white wall in our house. But white reflects light. And in 1600, when your light comes from a lantern or a candle, you want the most reflection you can get. Save as much daylight, it's going to reflect the daylight. Makes your house much more lit. It's not going to be until the 1700s that you get that, the red exterior that's kind of typical if you think of a New England farm with the red barn and the red house. That's later. The main room on the ground floor was usually called the hall. Meals were cooked in that fireplace. This is kind of a tidbit of information. The table was usually referred to as the board. And the father would get the only chair. So he was therefore the chairman of the board. I don't know how true that is, but it was in the textbook. I think it's kind of a fun fact. Everybody else either stood or used benches or stools. It was a little bit primitive to begin with. Forks aren't going to come around for a while. But they would have good, solid meals, corn, boiled meat, vegetable, cornbread, beer, cider, rum, milk. Water was not usually the drink of choice as the way it is now. Water was not always pure. And there are a lot of waterborne illnesses that once it's been fermented into beer, it's not an issue. Or the alcohol in the rum kills it. So even little kids drank beer. The work that they did was backbreaking, but not enough So it's subsistence farming to begin with, and it's subsistence farming in the South until they can get to where they can plant surplus crops. That's when you start needing excess labor and slaves. And while it may have taken 60 days to clear an acre of land from rocks and stumps, you're not going to get enough out of that acre to be able to afford to pay extra labor. One reason slavery didn't take off in the North. They would grow, once they did clear it, they would grow wheat and barley and oats. They also had grazing for cattle, swine, and sheep. Fishing was a big concern in the New England colonies, and the fishing grounds stretch all the way up to Newfoundland. They would catch cod, mackerel, halibut, whales. Whale fishing has got to be one of the scariest things, the way that they did it. It would take a ship out, find a pod of whales, harpoon a whale, and then you can't pull it up on the ship. Not intact, not in one piece. So to harvest the whale, you've got it held, you're holding it to the ship with the harpoons because they're deeply embedded in the flesh. You get off the ship and stand on the whale and cut the blubber off. So, and while you're doing this, obviously, blood is going to go into the water. Blood attracts sharks. So you have sharks attacking and eating the whale while you're trying to harvest it. Not my idea, and it's cold. I don't do anything in the cold. Not my idea of a good time, but whaling was a money-making endeavor. The whale blubber was used for all kinds of things, including oil for lamps. Fishing brought the settlers in contact with the world because they would trade. You would have fishermen from other areas. Brings to the north materialism, cosmopolitanism, which is both of those things are going to clash with the Puritan ideas that start out the colonies. Worldly goods are not high on the Puritans' list of things that are important. Your godly soul is what is important. But when you can buy something extra, it's kind of nice. And, you can get glass for that window now. It's really hard to turn down those extras that you're getting by commercial fishing. Fishing also encourages other trades. It encourages shipbuilding. It's much cheaper to build a ship in the colonies than it is to import wood to England. Even if you're having to import the wood from the South up to the New England colonies, it's still cheaper than sending it all the way across the ocean. A third of all British ships are going to be made in the colonies. And it takes about 2,000 trees to build a large ship. 4 to 6 months to build it. 30 skilled trade workers, about 200 general workers, all combined to build one ship. So you had shipwrights, carpenters, caulkers, sailmakers, blacksmiths, block makers, not sure what that one is, joiners, painters, chandlers, instrument makers. In turn, this encourages timbering, sawmills, iron foundries, sail lofts. So to make a sail, you have to have a place big enough to lay it out so that you can sew it. So a sail loft was like one of the upper floors of a building that had no interior walls. Fisheries, and of course taverns, because you have to have a place to kick back and relax. They used an apprentice journeyman system where people would sign on as an apprentice, kind of like an indentured servant, but not exactly. You're learning a trade. Eventually, you will move up to become a master or a journeyman. But you get a lot of variety in the New England colonies that you don't see in the South. By the end of the 17th century, trade was flourishing. Legally, they would trade with the British Isles and the British West Indies. Illegally, they would trade with Spain and France and Portugal and Holland and their colonies. You know, the idea of having a colony is it serves some other country. And that's all good and fine when the Spanish colonies are just right there and they want to buy what you have and they're willing to pay more than the British colonies are. It's really hard to turn them down and say, no, I'm not going to sell that to you. Also, they had things we wanted. Rum, I know rum keeps coming up, but rum was one of them. Rum is a big part of the illegal trade. They would import hardware, machinery, paint, navigation instruments, household items. They would export furs, deerskin, timber, fish, tobacco, indigo, rice, sugar. Now, if you've been paying attention, you know a lot of those deerskins, the tobacco, the indigo, the rice, and the sugar aren't coming from the New England colonies. But the New England colonies are the ones that are doing the exporting. They're acting as middlemen. This is going to be a problem for the South later on. The colonies were cash poor. Trade helps with this. They're also labor poor. As Benjamin Franklin said, land is plentiful, labor is not. Okay, New England different from the South. We've kind of talked about that. They lacked staple crops, but they had fishing. And they do a lot of the middleman trading. They're better at shipping and mercantilism. Still, they bought more than they sold. Materialism is going to be an issue in the New England colonies, particularly with the Puritan religion. They also got really good at avoiding taxes and finding other sources for staples and products. Basically, I'm saying they got really good at illegal trade, which will be a problem for England later on. Yeah. I think I have two the same. Nope, I just printed it wrong. They would send lumber and fish to Southern Europe. They traded with Newfoundland. They traded almost anything to the West Indies. West Indies were their biggest market. There was something that started called the triangular trade. So New England would send rum to Africa. Africa would send slaves to the West Indies. The West Indies would send various goods, including molasses, from which you make rum, back to New England. That was one of the triangular trades. The other, these are these illegal things that they did. The other was New England would send provisions to West Indies in exchange for sugar and molasses, which would be sent to England, therefore legal, and traded for various manufactured goods. But that money issue is a problem. So they would barter. They printed some paper money. They printed bills of credit. But Parliament is going to outlaw paper money throughout the colonies by 1764. saying that that is not their right to create. Okay, this is a good stopping point. No, that is not, where are we? Okay, I don't want to get into religion just yet. Let's wait and start that one on Monday. Good enough? All right. All right, and I will see you all on Monday. I'll probably also send an email out with this so that if anybody hadn't tuned in at the very beginning, they get the message. Get your test done if you haven't got it done. The one over British North America. You too.